It's my absolute immense pleasure to be back here in the offices of the Telegraph in London. And as many of you know, probably the leading podcast, one of the most authoritative and highly valued formats covering the war daily from Ukraine, is run out of this building and is run by an extraordinary team, including Francis Dearnley, who it is a great privilege and pleasure to be able to interview again today for the podcast. I know many of you watch Ukraine the latest. If you don't, I have to really question your life choices, but the links will be in the description of the video. It is now on video as well. It's not just an audio podcast. You can see their lovely faces for good and ill as well. It helps to bring it to life. Again, links in the description. Francis, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much for having me back on, Jonathan, and welcome to our new studio now. As you say, we are on video, and it's been, humbling. It's concerning as well that people have to see our faces every day, but you do still have the option of listening on audio as well, of course, on podcast. But it's been an amazing experience, and being able to bring people an increased level of coverage when so many are dropping off. I'm very glad that you're not either, but being able to bring footage, interviews, on the ground reporting in a format that more people can consume and that's more easily clippable has been really great. And I'm so thrilled that so many of your listeners are our listeners too, and viewers. So thank you all very much.
We have a bit of overlap. And I think one of the other things I gathered on a recent trip to Ukraine is that there are a lot of us, I think, doing a good job, but actually Ukrainians do not tune into most of the ecosystem, and that's natural because they have better sources of information in Ukrainian and sometimes Russian journalists like Vitaly Portnikov and others. But I think your format is one that is tuned into by a number of Ukrainians, especially those that have fluent English and are more in the activist and volunteer community. So that is also a big plus. Well, that's all the compliments out of the way.
There's a brutal questioning.
Let's hit the hard questions there. There's a bit of a softball start. We're going to start with the King's speech, which provided some extraordinary contrasts. The first one I'm going to throw at you here is we've got this incredible juxtaposition of King Charles supporting Ukraine so demonstrably and linking it to what is politically and morally right and strategically right as well. And he is applauded almost universally, except for Vance, who seems a little bit sour and sits through that particular bit. But that universal applause is not translated into political action. And in fact, many actions of the administration seem to be geared up to withholding support for Ukraine, blocking and stymieing support for Ukraine. Dare I say it, possibly even wishing for a swift defeat of Ukraine so they could get on with whatever it is they want to get on with. So there's this incredible juxtaposition, I would almost say hypocrisy, in that spectacle.
Yes, it was an extraordinary speech, not only because it was the first time that a British king had ever addressed a joint session of Congress, but also because he clearly went much further than only espousing the British national interest. He actually was talking about it from the perspective of the West and Ukraine and something more, something higher. And I thought that was extremely admirable. And it was cheering to see the way that it was received in the chamber, perhaps more vocally supportive of Ukraine than many of us expected. And yet, as you say, Jonathan, this comes in tandem with a White House which is fundamentally, I think, disinterested in the war or overtly hostile to it. There are welcome developments. Only in the last 48 hours or so at the time of our recording, the $400 million package that was frozen in the Pentagon has been unlocked. That is progress, and partly that is because I think of the pressure building up in Congress that was articulated by the King's visit. But more broadly, we are seeing a continuation of the US disengagement, really, unless there is a profit motive in it for them, which is, of course, the purchasing of weapons by the Europeans and then giving them to the Ukrainians. That is a huge positive development, and I think credit should be paid to those who managed to negotiate that in Europe. But the concern is, of course, in the context of Iran, that and the Pacific. Let's remember that 2027 is the date sometimes seen as being possible for a move on Taiwan by the Chinese. That they could turn off the tap of the Pearl Initiative at any moment, and if that happens, then it is a very precarious one indeed. And so I really hope that if the European strategy has been to buy time and gradually wean themselves off the dependence on the Americans, that they're making the most of it, and that we're not merely waiting for what comes after this administration. Because if they are, then I think that is a very dangerous gamble indeed. At the end of the day, the bipartisan assumptions embedded in the American position on Western defence are no longer bipartisan, and we need to really and seriously wake up to that brave new world.
I fear we are certainly not moving at pace, and indeed the UK. I hadn't got this on my list of questions, but let's jump in there, because the sort of, not the national security policy, but the new sort of defence analysis that was being done with Lord Robertson, Fiona Hill, and others very eminent in their field. And we hear from people like Keir Giles and others that this document is saying all the right things, it's going in the right direction, and it was not opposed in principle, any of the points by Keir Starmer, which is unusual, it has to be said. But actually the movement isn't there, the pressure on the Treasury isn't there to unlock the funds. And this is just a starting point. This isn't the full plan that's required for the defence of the realm, dare I say it. But even that it's waiting on the starting blocks. What are they waiting for? Did you find it unusual that the authors of that report have spoken out in such a vocal and highly politically charged fashion?
Oh, I think it's unprecedented, particularly given the language that they used, and I commend them for it. I think if you believe, we believe, that the world is becoming a far more dangerous place, and that the assessments by the intelligence services in Germany, Estonia, Britain, even the United States, that Russia would be ready to make moves elsewhere if it so chose in a handful of years after a ceasefire in Ukraine. If you believe those assessments, then we are facing a similar situation to the 1930s here, where governments have been so focused on domestic affairs that we have not been prioritising the big danger coming down the road. And the argument that is made, and I think is very true, is that as expensive as it may be to build up a strong deterrence now, it's far more expensive if things go wrong, not just economically, but of course in every respect, in terms of manpower, morale, and loss of life, most fundamentally. So I commend them for the fact that they came out and said what they said, and it was brave of them to do so, because they know that as a consequence of that, it's meant that the report may well be seen of in hostile terms in Whitehall, but clearly they felt that it already was.
Absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Well, we'll come back to the 1930s, because that is a fascinating topic, and with the historical background, I think we can make some good traction out of that. Turning back to Congress and Vance, he was the one who perhaps was intelligent enough. I mean, I don't want to be rude about Mike Johnson, but I'm not sure he really understood the implication and the subtext of what the king was saying. And I think it's an absolutely sort of scathing little nudge he gave them there, which is, the king of the country you booted out to establish liberties. And I'm stealing, Anthony Scaramucci's analysis here. The king came to Congress to remind the US of the values, the founding principles that caused them to boot us out, and remind them that actually those are important and that they are veering very far away from them. Extraordinary. Vance got it, I think, because his sour face throughout seemed to demonstrate that. And I want to tie that in with something Zelensky said. And Vance has said he's demonstrably against Ukraine. He's proud of having stopped the Ukraine aid. And Zelensky, in his usual way, captured that, I think, very well. If you're not supporting Ukraine, you are supporting Russia by default. As Hannah Arendt or someone said, that the appeasement or tolerance of evil is actually the enablement of evil. I mean, I put it in those terms, but do you feel that that's what we're witnessing here in someone like Vance?
Well, one thing I would say on President Zelensky's remarks about Vance is it shows how much of a stronger position the Ukrainians feel that they are at the beginning of 2026. I don't think he would have made those remarks in late 25, and that is, of course, a positive direction, I think, on multiple levels. The Vance situation also is worth observing for a moment. He, I think, saw himself as the heir apparent. His star has fallen following Iran and the consequences of that. And I think also him being sent out to Hungary saying you must vote for Viktor Orban, and then of course the 48 hours later as a landslide the other way. I mean, it's not a great look for him. And I've been fascinated to observe the power struggle on foreign policy between Vance and Rubio. There are different interpretations of Rubio's real position, but I think that few can doubt that compared to Vance, he is at the very least somebody who has more of the neocon in him, more of the hawk. And they clearly are battling each other for the future of the Republican and Trump movement, but also on the issue of what they believe America's stance on foreign conflicts should be. Venezuela was a huge success for Rubio. His star, as I say, was on the ascendancy. It may well have contributed to the miscalculations made about Iran, by the way. But on Ukraine, of course, we all know about his interventions when the negotiations were taking place in Geneva, which were exceedingly positive, I think, from the Ukrainian perspective, and will have come as an immense relief because of the direction of travel of Vance's people. And I think in those two figures you see a broader tension in the United States, which has become obviously increasingly apparent to us in the European sphere, but which we'd largely forgotten and taken for granted in the 1945 and even post-Cold War era, which is that there has always been a very deep ideological fault line over isolationism versus interventionism. And it dates all the way back to the Founding Fathers, which you reference there. I mean, yes, they, in a sense, were fighting for liberty, or so they claimed, although I would say that it's a big mistake leaving Britain behind, of course, as a patriot.
We did rather better after independence as well.
Yeah, it was a costly enterprise, keeping an empire. But anyway, that's by the by. But John Adams, the second president of the United States, very much an isolationist in his belief about what would be to the long-term benefit of the United States. His direct successor, fellow founding father, Thomas Jefferson, interventionist, believes in principles that are higher, that America has a duty to help uphold, wants to engage in foreign wars in order to defend them. Extraordinary contrast that played out between the two men then in the fiercest possible terms. I mean, you think the language that Trump uses now about world leaders is strong. You should see some of the pamphlets between those two sides back then. I'm not endorsing it, but it's just interesting to observe. So I just draw attention to this, that this has always been a tension in the American politic. Of course, it was perhaps most well known in relation to the First World War and what happened after that with the League of Nations and the fact that America chose not to be part of it, despite the fact that the architect of it, Wilson, had driven it as being the sort of the post-World War architecture that he wanted to see the world develop. So, Vance belongs to a tradition here, and that's what I want to really underscore when we talk about him, is that even if he doesn't succeed, the views that he articulates are not going to go away. And they've been embedded already in the national security strategy, which speaks about a very different perception of Europe, the idea of supporting certain countries that are going in certain ideological directions. So it's a different reality than the one that we have known, and it's not going to disappear anytime soon, if ever. So Europe has to be thinking about Ukraine and its own security as its own problem. And I remember us saying that the last time that we spoke.
I think we did say that, yeah, we did, and here we are, we're still here. Yeah. I mean, Europe seems to have woken up a little bit. There are more joint ventures, there's more emphasis on drones. Britain is developing drones, and I hear from contacts on the ground that they're not half bad. A lot of drones are actually supplied by Western partners at exorbitant cost, it has to be said, end up in warehouses are just dumped because they're not fit for purpose when they arrive. That's a whole other can of worms, which we won't get into.
Battle tested doesn't mean battle ready. They just means they've been tested there and then not failed, as Dom often says on the podcast.
And some haven't even been tested there, even though they're labelled as battle tested, which is even worse. It puts Ukraine's at risk. So we seem to be waking up partially, which is good. But I want to put the idea here that actually we put it as a sort of dichotomy between traditional neocon views, which actually, from our perspective now, are not the worst, because they also put an emphasis on partners, on the American military network around the world being able to project power and only being able to do it through partners and alliances. And we're not looking at a three-stool conflict here, though. We've got that neocon view represented by Rubio. We've got Trumpism and those that are following it, which actually seems to be an incredibly aggressive form of neo-transactional imperialism, which actually is moving the world towards spheres of influence, and an extraordinary idea that doesn't necessarily follow back to, as you say, any of those founding principles at all. It's more rooted in well, dare I say it, Russian imperialist mechanics. And then you have the isolationists, those who are like, right, maybe we mess around in our backyard, but we're withdrawing from the world, which possibly Vance is a representative. So we've got these three competing ideologies, as it were, or maybe ideology is the wrong word for it.
Well, that's what I was going to say as a response to that, is I think it slightly overestimates the degree of chaos with... Sorry, let me rephrase that. Well, that was going to be my point, Jonathan, in reply to that, because I think it perhaps slightly underestimates the degree to which there isn't a fixed ideology in this White House. It is shaped by the whims of an increasingly erratic man. You know, when we talk about ideologies, we like to always think that there are foundational texts, that there is a platform that has been shaped by political theorists over the centuries, at the very least the decades. I just do not see that being present in that third way that you just articulate. I think that we're seeing somebody who probably was persuaded by certain neocon type figures within the administration with regard to Iran. I don't think it necessarily represents some other new ideological position that is, you know, imperialist, to use your word, or anything else. I think we're in danger, as is a common problem with regard to President Trump, of seeing profound principles at work when really we're dealing with somebody who wakes up and has different viewpoints every day.
Depending on who he's spoken
Depending
to
on
last,
who he's spoken to. And this is a common trait in leaders.
Putin, it has to be said. Yes.
Well, indeed. And you know, whoever finds him in the best mood or the most persuasive. And this doesn't... You know, I'm very aware that this can sound conspiratorial, but this is a man who just picks up the phone to journalists, as he does with our Washington correspondent, Connor Stringer, and thank goodness, because it gives us insights into his mentality.
But you haven't been treated to one of these little...
I have not, sadly not, no, but perhaps one day I'll be fortunate enough, or unfortunate enough, depending on one's point of view. But I think, you know, let's not imagine that Trump is... Somebody said something to me recently, so I can't go through an interview without mentioning Napoleon, of course. You know, there's the famous line from Hegel that he's the world spirit on horseback, right? That he captured the zeitgeist, Napoleon, at the moment. He was the age. And to a certain degree, that was possibly true because he shaped it. I don't think that we should be seeing Trump in the same way. And yes, he is representative of certain trends, but the idea that there is some sort of overarching philosophical movement underpinning Trumpism, rather than just the chaos of a mind that is fundamentally ill-disciplined and ill-fitted for the office, I think is a dangerous one.
Let me put that in other terms then, because there is a movement. There is a movement from the rules-based order, as it's called, which some scoff at, but I think is very real and helped to define the 20th century, and there's lots of aberrations for that. But broadly speaking, an extraordinary advancement of humanity, technology, civilization, very much with the US at the head of that. There is a clear tendency for that rules-based order not just to be collapsing through sort of, you know, managerial myopia and lack of leadership, but it's being torn down, and it's being torn down quite consciously by China and Russia, I think, for differing reasons, and the autocracies of the world. Now, Trump may not be an ideologue in this process, but it seems to me he is going with the flow of that, maybe because it feels natural to him, maybe because it's just easier and there's less friction. Maybe it's because Putin rather, is supporting him in that, guiding him towards it with resources and little nudges. But there is, behind the scenes, this definite tendency, and I got this phrase that I worked out earlier, which I have to use because I quite like it. It's almost as if this new world order is pupating, and it's consuming the energy of the current world order, and we seem to think, we're living in the world that is the same, but actually there's a terrifying new world, chaos, growing inside the shell of our previous world.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that. I think that the question is not whether the change is occurring, it's whether it's a conscious change orchestrated, right? As opposed to just being the natural consequence of decisions made in error, at least as I would see it. I mean, I've been long arguing from the very first year of the war that the danger always, to your point, is that change is so incremental that it's hard to observe. This conflict has been changing the moral architecture of the world we inhabit deeply already over the last 4 years. I mean, to what extent is any more Ukraine's sufferance on the front pages? Really, compared to before, it's not. And yet the worst raids of the war have been this year in terms of numbers. That shocks people when I say that to them, because they assume that it's quietened down. That is what a shifting world looks like. I think, and I can't believe I'm quoting him in this context, but I think it's a brilliant, brilliant point that he articulates perfectly. It's Quentin Crisp, who will be a figure familiar.
That's not what I expected.
No, a very erudite man, if you listen to some of the interviews that he gave in the past, and particularly his memoirs like The Naked Civil Servant. But he says that change really is boredom. People have become bored of seeing the same headlines, same stories. I'm talking about the public at large here. And that is what change is. When people become bored of something, before you know it, you've accepted horror. And it's how human beings are capable of walking past emaciated, starving people in war zones, or as you hear soldiers describe in this war, passing their dead colleagues. When it becomes every day, it no longer shocks you. But the reason that we have international law, the reason that we have history being taught, the reason that these things are meant to be institutionalised is to stop this slippage. It is to remember. But I think the most shocking thing has been seeing how actually people don't really want to remember. However much we say never again, in fact, it was never as deeply rooted as we thought. But just because I'm aware that some people will be shouting at the screen at what I've just said, I don't believe that people are, tired of the war in Ukraine in the sense of they care about it less. I think rather because things have been, from the perspective of the layman, relatively static on the front lines, they've not been able to follow it as much. But what's been fascinating to observe is that when there is a major story relating to Ukraine, everybody comes back. And I emphasise that because I think war fatigue is overplayed and is sometimes used by politicians to justify inaction. When actually, in terms of our numbers, we had a record month only last month in terms of listeners and viewers. So they are still out there, but it is not necessarily every single day in the level that it was. But they still care passionately about it, and they know what's at stake, particularly in Britain, I think, and it speaks to our history in a way we've talked about before.
I think I entirely agree with all of that, and I think I see the same. Although it is the activist community, it's the bubble re-engaging, not necessarily building a new audience. I think there are a lot of people out there who tuned out in the first year, not because they're bad people at all, but it's because just the sheer weight of horror and despair and not knowing what to do. It's a burden, I think, of sorts, which most people will want to continue with their lives. There's another point I want to make here, and this is one which I talk with Ukrainians about and have done at some depth. I fear that there is a failure of historic imagination, even amongst many who are pro-Ukraine and following Ukraine. That failure is to understand that modern incarnation of Russia is in many ways morally and politically no better than the Stalin era. There's a difference in scale, there's a difference in method, but actually the Gulag has been outsourced to Donbass. What you have is a huge territory that is lawless and is a giant torture camp of the most unspeakable horrors comparable to anything in the Second World War. There is a failure to imagine that is possible in the modern day, and a failure to imagine how we should have the moral imperative to stop that at all costs. And I'm afraid to say, even amongst pro-Ukraine politicians, and even some activists, there's a failure to fully internalise the sheer visceral horrors of what Russia is, what it inflicts on its neighbours, and to strategically deal with that.
I hate to repeat myself, Jonathan, and say something that I've said in previous interviews, but because of the importance of this subject, I'd like to vocalise something again. So apologies if people have heard me say this before. In terms of my generation, we are the children of Francis Fukuyama in many respects. The end of history was what was preached quite literally, in the sense of, I remember teachers saying the internet means the shrinking of the world, wars are going to become largely an impossibility as people become more combined and intertwined, and all of these arguments of which we are very familiar. You also had a generation of politicians that came of age in the end of the Cold War, which leads to, I think, a misunderstanding about history itself.
We should have listened to David Bowie rather than Fukuyama, because David Bowie predicted waves of chaos and change, the like of which we haven't experienced.
Yes, it's a great interview there. I know the one to which you refer. A very, very articulate man, David. I think he read a book a day in his latter years, so extremely. And you can read his reading lists online, which hold up even to the present. But to your point about historical imagination, this is a common psychological trait in human beings, that when they are instilled with a certain belief about what the world is and what you should expect it to be, it's very, very hard even for the facts to shake you out of that. And the other example that I've given is that I believe I even said on our previous interview together is Jan Karski, who was the Polish representative of the Polish government in exile during the Second World War. He met with President Roosevelt, he met with the British government here, and was vocalising clearly with facts which are well known today, what was going on in terms of the Holocaust in Poland. And effectively he described very, very eloquently afterwards in interviews, more eloquently than I'm going to be able to vocalise now, the degree to which it was impossible for people to believe that this was happening, that they were faced with the facts, they were faced with the photographs, and they still couldn't believe it. It wasn't until the camps were liberated that it suddenly became possible, because it was undeniable. Of course, you mentioned the Gulag system in Russia. Part of the tragedy for our collective understanding of Russia is that the Gulags were never liberated. They were dismantled and disappeared and erased from the historical record in terms of physically.
Some of them are still out there in the tundra. I've passed one. And this was an interesting moment, passing up to people who asked why I was doing there, but there's another conversation, on a train to Vorkuta. And the snow on the ground, and there's the skeletal remains of a prison camp, all the watchtowers, the walls, everything, just literally abandoned the day, I guess, the 1950s, where it was wound up. And I tried to engage people in the carriage in conversation, and they were like, yeah, it's just another camp.
Yes.
It's just another camp. There's no emotional resonance.
Well, that's why I said there's no stage in which they were systematically memorialised and the testimonies recorded, that they're there, but not all of them are. Some of them were erased.
Some of them were erased.
But they're still there. Their physical presence is felt. But they are not part of the collective understanding, neither in Russia, but even more broadly across the Western world. And I think a large part of that is because of the fact that they were not liberated, as it were, and so many were killed or disappeared in them. It's one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, I would say. I mean, you still see it today. I mean, you know, we obsess over the Nazis and the fascists, and nowhere near to the same degree do the same to the communists. I mean, we all know of experiences at university where people will wave Lenin and Stalin, Trotsky at you and sort of say this, that and the other about the world revolution gone wrong. And as brilliant biographies by historians like Robert Service have underscored, particularly in Trotsky's case, who was always seen as the prophet that never was, because of Stalin's purging of him, shown these people were just as monstrous, really. And Lenin particularly got away with murder, literally.
Mass murder.
Because of the perceived, you know, what he was seen as representing in the quashing of the Tsarist regime.
To him. The Civil War, which killed many millions. Of untold horrors, is his decision.
But also the letters, the venom in the letters. There's one in particular that I recall reading at university that stuck with me, where he's talking about liquidating the kulak class. You know, those who had property and land particularly. It was the venom is present. And I'd highly recommend a book by Douglas called Former People, which is about the destruction of the Russian aristocracy. A fascinating and horrific read. I mean, I had to read it over years because I just found it so harrowing to read about the systematic uprooting of innocent, because also this is something very important to underscore. There's always an association with the aristocracy of thinking that it's similar to the French aristocracy in the revolution of the 18th century. Small and all of them uber, wealthy to the point of utter decadence and everything at Versailles, the image of Versailles. The Russian aristocracy was very, very different, more akin to the British aristocracy in the sense that you can have very poor members of the aristocracy. Yes, they might have a nicer country pile somewhere.
Two-storey house, but still quite run down.
But still quite run down. I mean, I had a friend once who once said to me, he was a member of the minor British aristocracy, who said, true, the posher you are, the poorer you are, in the sense of, I know it sounds a ridiculous thing and I'm not comparing real poverty with this, but sort of the idea of people having blankets in their country pile somewhere is very true. This was reality in Russia in the late 19th century and early 20th century as well. The aristocracy was far, far wider and in many ways could be articulated as being more upper middle class than anything else. Didn't matter to the Bolsheviks. They were uprooted, they were destroyed and purged and shot in their millions. And I think it is relevant very much to today that we underscore this point, because when you look at those who defend Russia in some ways, they always say this is the country of Tolstoy, this is the country of Dostoevsky, there's always another side, there's always an opposition. And I would say, well, there was, but a lot of them were murdered.
Yes, absolutely. And this is something, it's a difficult conversation with Ukrainians, but I feel Russia could have gone in a different way. Between 1905 and 1914, there were extraordinary changes and an alternative country that could have emerged from there. That's not a popular view necessarily. It's one that maybe needs a little more, let's say, academic rigor behind it. But as you say, the destruction and the kulak class themselves, which is the upwardly mobile working class, represents a huge destruction of people who were hardworking, many of whom were not, let's say, booze sossled, as it were, and many of whom chose not the mainstream Russian Orthodoxy, but the Starovertsy, I think they were called, which was an alternative version, much more associated with merchants, those who are hardworking, upwardly mobile, see transition of wealth and values from one generation to another. They were all consciously destroyed. Let's turn back to Europe, because there's another tendency here, which we're coming back to this idea of intentionality versus accident, and I veer more towards somebody is intentionally following some kind of plan, but it's a question as to who and why. We have various things. We have the removal of training resources from the Baltics. We have the attempt to suck out air defense systems from Poland, with Iran being the excuse. That was resisted, fortunately. We now have the threat to remove forces from Germany. We have the very invidious stoking of the pot to try and stir up a new invasion of the Falklands, which, can we even imagine if we got sucked into that, how our eye would be taken off the ball in Ukraine? I fear that these are all the point. The point here is to render Europe vulnerable, to force it to stockpile weapons, which it then won't send to Ukraine, and to make it vulnerable perhaps for something else. It could be a full-scale hybridized assault on Europe, or, as most of the analyst chatter goes, the Narva scenario, which I don't actually buy into, and I don't believe the Baltics are a pushover either.
Definitely
as
not.
Edward Lucas
Definitely
points
not.
out.
Yeah.
He rages at this
I remember
idea,
an Estonian official saying, if these troops came across, we would shoot them. There's always these hypothetical scenarios where they wouldn't. It's like, we would shoot them.
Absolutely. I mean, we know the Winter War and how that played out. But that doesn't mean that Putin won't try something. And indeed, his regime, I think, is going to be more and more desperate. The question is, are there forces and tendencies within the US that are consciously weakening Europe for one reason or another? Because the pattern certainly seems to very strongly hint at that?
Yeah, to be clear, I don't doubt that there is intentionality behind these actions. I would say what I question is that there is a deep-rooted philosophy underpinning all of it. There might be in the cases of a few individuals who really believe some of this stuff, but in terms of it being a broader movement of people, I would perhaps question that to a degree. But yes, absolutely, there are attempts within this administration to sow discord within Europe, who dislike the European Union in particular, would like to see it dismantled, literally. I mean, this is basically, it doesn't say it in quite these terms, but a staple of the American national security strategy.
It's in there.
It's in
very,
there.
Very clearly
it's you know,
yeah.
it doesn't say it, as I say, quite vocally in that way, but it's obvious. And so, you know, I do believe that a lot of these actions are underpinned, but I do believe also that a large number of them are, to use the journalistic political term, dead cats too. You're throwing the dead cat on the table because something's going wrong elsewhere. And it's just that sort of chaos of getting through this day, getting through this week. You know, I used to work in Westminster here, and I think it has changed my perception of history quite deeply and how events unfold, because I just really understood the degree to which, if only we lived in a world where there were proper strategies, long-term planning and philosophies underpinning things. In the modern world, with social media and 24-hour news and everything else, people just want to survive that day. And whilst there are trends and patterns, and I don't disagree with that, Jonathan, to be very, very clear, I do agree that there are those who want to cause harm to the world in which we know. I think a lot of it is just like, what can we throw, what chaos can we cause today that will lead to different headlines? I think that's Trump's default setting, actually, is he's like, this isn't going well, what can I say? And he revels in it. This is why he wants to speak to journalists all the time, and why he wants them to call him up, is he wants the media landscape to be dominated with what he is saying, because it sucks out the air of every other issue. But I'm very aware that this is going to be one of the great questions for future historians, is the degree of intentionality from above to below versus just the chaos of top down versus something more akin to Ian Kershaw's argument with the example of Germany in the 30s and 40s of people working towards the leadership, i.e. they think there is a philosophy and they decide, in order to try and impress their higher ups, that they need to interpret that a certain way and act upon it. But the key, Jonathan, there is they don't necessarily believe it themselves. They think that they have to do this in order to conform to what they see as being a movement, a belief, a set core principle architecture, which actually may not really be present. I really recommend Kershaw's biographies because he underscores this point very clearly, and I think it has a lot of lessons far beyond that theatre.
It's what Timothy Schneider, I think, calls the politics of inevitability, which actually favours those with an authoritarian plan and a mindset, a kleptocratic mindset, because in the absence, I guess, of resistance and values, which we had in the Cold War, to hold the Soviet Union at bay, and indeed a balance was found. The lesson we forgot there is, you know, if you present a hard barrier to Russian foreign policy, then it will accommodate itself to that and do something else. But that's what we've not presented, is that hard barrier. But with Timothy Schneider, it suggests that this loosening of the world order you've talked about that Trump is doing, that favours those that have this authoritarian plan and the will and resource to then guide events towards. It suggests the counter to that is simply that we need to have a plan. If we had a plan, actually these chaotic tyrants wouldn't be making much headway.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there was a great interview that I did with someone recently, but I can't talk about it yet because it's not out. But they said something which I thought was very important, so that you could name on one hand the number of people who were the chief architects of the expansion of NATO in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you sort of think, yeah, you know, that is true to a certain degree, that there are some very important figures whose names we don't even know who built this world, but they had principles, they had intelligence, they had an understanding of how to make change predicated on hard power and principles. And that's what's been lost, and deliberately lost. You know, it's been gutted out of the White House. It's been gutted out of many of the State Departments and the Pentagon deliberately, the think tank world, because they're seen as, well, the argument is often given that they were too expensive, but we all know it's also ideological as well, that they're seen as being advocates of an anti-Trump worldview, if indeed we can see it in that way, or just anti-Trump. Actually, let's not say worldview. Just Trump, anti-Trump. And so for that reason, that's enough for them to be stripped of theirs. But the real danger is, and again, this speaks to why Europe has to be planning longer term of just beyond Trump is that once that knowledge is uprooted, you can't replant a plant that's been killed. And they may well try if there's a Democrat administration or a more hawkish Republican president. But we're talking about people who have been removed from their roles, and you've lost decades of collective knowledge. So I don't think the United States is ever going to be the same again, at least not for a generation.
That is to say, I mean, this leads very much on to this the question that I wanted to ask as well. That back to King Charles' speech, what we're seeing is, let's say, the performative vestiges of the old world order, and we see this in NATO as well. That facade of the old world order is being managed now by bureaucrats, or those with a very managerial rather than a leadership mindset. And they're doing a good job of creating this illusion, this Potemkin facade that we still live in the same world. And I tend to be non-partisan, but it seems to me that we have a managerial class, not a leadership class. Rutte, Starmer, Macron, and many others, they're reactive people. They're upholding an order that is essentially behind the scenes, is just a billboard. It no longer exists, but they don't have the imagination and courage to accept those facts and say, no, we have to actually build something back in that sort of vacated lot.
Well, it's the idea of managed decline, isn't it? And that there is actually no way back to about turn things. I mean, this is cyclical in history. I don't disagree with your critique of the bureaucratic managerial class. I think that it's something that's been certainly common in this country for a long time, and others. Macron, I think, is of the names that you mentioned, is perhaps slightly a bit more of an outlier. I think he is a thinker. I think he does understand issues on a deeper level and wants to do more perhaps than he is able to do because of the political context in France at the moment. But I've been very critical of France in the past for talking the talk and not walking the walk. So it's still, I think, a valid point. But I think Macron does understand what's at stake in a way that I think is just a totally alien concept to somebody like Keir Starmer, who is not historically minded. He's a lawyer, and that matters too, and I think he does have a respect for things like international law, but it's I don't see also in Starmer somebody who really understands hard power. No. And that there are people, you imagine, a lawyer's mentality, a lawyer's mentality is such that the rules of the game are always going to be in play. There's always going to be the bench there, and your rival is right there, and you've just got to win the case in front of the judge or the jury, right? We're in a world where the rules are gone. How does somebody who only operates in that world move forward? I would argue that you can't. What you need in a period like this is somebody who really understands what hard power is, the reality of how the world is moving away from those collective organisations, and what new world you want to create as a consequence of that. My fear is, unfortunately, that our systems no longer encourage those kind of thinkers, that in a sense we have created a politic that is incapable of producing those who could solve the problems.
Here's an irony. Boris Johnson is someone who, through most of his career, seemed to have a high degree of contempt to be held by rules and order and even law, and would seek to adapt the world to his needs. It's not Trumpian narcissism, but there's certainly something there of wanting to bend the world to his will. Is it actually one of the reasons why he's the few that saw the threat in Ukraine, one of the few that actually seemed to kind of get that? Because he recognises this is a world without rules. And
it's a very interesting point. That's a fascinating point. I've never thought of that before.
Not until you said it.
I'll have to reflect upon that. I think that's certainly true, that the psychology of Mr. Johnson, who I've interviewed where you're sitting actually, may have played to his understanding about where the world was going. I think also just his knowledge of Churchill, which is deep, actually. It's one of the few things I think where he does have a deeper understanding, and of that era which shaped this, as well as, of course, his desire to be a world figure. Let's not underestimate exactly, and let's not underestimate that either. But I think too that in Johnson's case, so I've often felt that a great leader, or at least a great British Prime Minister, has to have three attributes. You have to have charisma, you have to have competency, and you have to have cut-through, i.e. the public listening and an ability to be heard and understood, and for people to adapt their behaviour accordingly. Now, we have not had a leader who's combined all of those three since, and even this is debatable, Blair. And I'm very critical of Blair on a lot of issues, not least on attitudes, naive attitudes and assumptions with regard to the Middle East on foreign policy. But I don't think that you can deny, even his enemies would acknowledge that he was a statesman and he got a lot done. We are still living in the post-Blair world in Britain in many respects. Whereas if you look at someone like Sunak, he's competent, has no charisma or cut-through. Boris Johnson has charisma, has cut-through, no competency. You have to have all three in order to be effective. And I'd say what I question is whether the zeitgeist, the system, however, the establishment, however one wants to articulate, actually will not allow for all three to be present. And I've become increasingly interested in this over the years, this sort of idea of the medium being the message, the medium being the world, that, Trump is not possible without social media, and the 24-hour news cycle, that we are all just being pushed in a certain direction by the undercurrents of an age rather than sort of conscious decision making, which I know plays more into perhaps your argument, but I would say it's not all intentional. It's the mediums themselves that are the drivers of change. So I don't want to be misinterpreted as putting forward there the Tolstoyan argument, which is it's collective from below. I'm actually talking about it not being people, it being systems. Which makes me almost sound like a bit of a Marxist.
Yes, I was going to say. Yeah.
Ironically,
Hegelian
being in the Telegraph. Yeah.
And that's an interesting, and I wanted to fire this one at you, given where we are, given that the Telegraph has a more conservative leaning, in big C terms and small c terms, and of course, we were getting into this mindset that the advance of the populist was inevitable. I have to say, unfortunately, in this country, there seems to have been, in the BBC and other institutions, a sense of inevitability of Farage. No matter the oncoming disaster that would be, I'm going to be partisan about that at least, but there's a sense of resigning yourself to something that's inevitable. The defeat of Viktor Orban, it seems to me, shows that the march of populists is not inevitable unless we let it be inevitable. But it also raises another interesting issue. I'm going to fire at you here, which is this struggle shouldn't be framed in terms of left or right. It's a question of freedoms versus kleptocracies and non-freedoms or erosion of freedoms. Is it not perhaps, let's say, the principled right or principled conservatism is actually in the best position to counter kleptocratic authoritarian conservatism?
I think in this country, not yet, because they're too discredited by the time in government, fundamentally, I think. And that's my personal view. That's not kleptocracy. That's just my own personal view to emphasise. There'd be many colleagues here I think would disagree with that perspective. I don't think you're wrong, by the way, about us over-egging culturally as a country, the BBC, however, the inevitability of a reform government. I do still think that we're heading towards them doing exceedingly well, but I think that nothing is inevitable, and perhaps some of his associations with President Trump, depending on things go, could cause considerable harm, and Orban as well. But I think the Hungarian example is very interesting. So listeners to Ukraine the Latest will know that I did a lot of reporting in Hungary before this election. I interviewed a lot of Orban's officials. And God, I had to sit through arguments to which I profoundly disagreed, and I did vocalise them. But also, it's very important that they're given the platform to articulate their views freely. And if you want to listen to those episodes, they're all still there. It's an interesting historical record now because they're all out of power. But I think it's something.
Similar, there'll all be a little hotel in Moscow.
I think a lot of them are going over to the United States
US,
actually,
yeah,
and
right.
That's where they want to be running think tanks and things like that. But anyway. Hungary's a very interesting example because I think there's been a tendency, for understandable reasons, for, let's say, liberals, and I don't mean in a left-right sense, I mean like those who kind of believe in freedoms and principles, they see what's happened, they see this as, to your point, that the march of a certain history stopping. I think we need to be very cautious. Hungary, yes, has just seen a landslide against Orban, but not necessarily all of the tenets of Orbanism. It has moved away basically from a government that was in charge for a very long time. That's always 16 years is a long time to expect to then win another majority. It's basically never happens in free elections. So there's that aspect. But it's also, more importantly, Magyar himself is quite populist.
Yes.
He is still, in a lot of his language, quite critical of the European Union in a way that is typical in Hungary. I know he's just gone over to Brussels, but his language is still framed in that way. Likewise, Ukraine, to a certain degree, thankfully a much less degree than Orban, but it's still, part and parcel of this on a lot of issues that people feel very passionately about in Europe.
Ukraine is a conservative country.
Yes.
You wouldn't know that from the MAGA mindset. Very small C conservative. Strong religion, strong emphasis on identity, and in some ways, that's what I meant by actually we should be exploring these things as one of the solutions.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point about this idea of certain principles that have been forgotten being restored to us, which I think is the essence of conservatism, really, right? Certainly Burke put that view forward when he was reflecting on what happened in France, which is a great, not read enough anymore actually, but Burke's is a foundational text and is brilliant. And anybody who responds and reports on and watches and reads about the violence that we're seeing here, I think will really understand his anger at those who relish violence in any form.
Combined with the Leviathan of Hobbes, and got good foundational stuff.
Exactly. But yes, as I say, going back to Hungary, in different circumstances, there would be liberals in Western countries in the European Union having their head in their hands at Magyar's victory. They would say that his nickname in the EU was Baby Orban in the old days. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful about not putting wishful thinking on these elections. I do think it's a positive step for Hungary in the Ukraine context. I do think that it will lead to quite profound changes within Hungary itself. We're already seeing that in the policies that he's adopting. But the idea that this means that populism itself, scepticism of collectivism is disappearing, I think is a step slightly too far. But I do agree that the restoration of principles too in this kind of postmodern age or whatever may well be where we start to return to. The danger is, of course, is that we slip too far and it takes a real crisis and horror to go back.
And I think, there's one for another conversation, but the idea of a positive version of nationalism is something that would be potentially quite healthy to rediscover. Well,
I think Ukrainians would say they have that, you see.
They absolutely do. And actually it's a key part of their resilience and existence.
Yes. I completely agree with that. Nationalism became a dirty word because it was associated immediately with imperialism, in essence.
That's right.
That was the argument.
But if you lived in Scotland, I went to university in Scotland, and it's got a very different flavour. Okay, you have there is a toxic side to, let's say, fringe SNP.
Yes.
But actually, broadly speaking, cultural nationalism is almost essential for cohesion.
There's one other thing I just wanted to say as a corollary to what we were just talking about, which is that for me, the big danger actually is if we do see the defenestration of the post-1945 world order, or let's even just not go back that far, the end of the Cold War, if that does disappear, what we will start seeing in Europe is countries choosing based on their own self-interest as opposed to some appeal to broader values, which sides they start backing. So you'll have certain countries that are more like the Belaruses, more like the Hungaries, that start saying, no, we're going to hedge our bets on China, actually, rather than the United States, or we're going to go more closely aligned with Russia, or whatever. And then
Dragon Bear, which actually the two are probably going to become almost indivisible as Russia gets subsumed by China economically.
That's apparently one of the arguments that was always put forward in the United States by those who were hostile against the idea of the war being ended with a decisive, military victory for Ukraine, as they were sort of fearful that a collapse of Russia economically and militarily would lead them straight into the arms of China by inevitably. But I would say it's already happening anyway. But that's by the by. But that's my fear, Jonathan, is that you can imagine a Europe in 10 or 15 years where you've got countries that are basically taking very different ideological positions on who are enemies, and who our friends are. And very quickly, things become very complicated and very compromised.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the very last one's probably a quick one, and this is just to wrap it all up, because I know we're both fascinated by history, and we've got some evocations of history here. We've got the idea that was expressed to me that actually Ukraine is Czechoslovakia if Czechoslovakia had fought and been backed by Britain, say, to keep the Nazis at bay. And then we have the spectre of 1917 being raised on the Duma floor by another one of Putin's puppet politicians, Gennady Zhuganov, the communist leader. But you have these historical ideas being floated around. I just find that kind of fascinating.
It is fascinating. And it does speak to still the collective memory of the 1930s and 40s and the mistakes that were made. I mean, I've done a bit of reading on Czechoslovakia's position, and I think that whilst they could have fought, they probably couldn't have fought for that long. Ukraine's a very different entity than Czechoslovakia, but I know that that's not the point that's being made in that argument. But nonetheless, I think the idea that they could
long
have
enough
fought
for us to get our act together.
Maybe I'm still not even convinced of that, and part of that's cultural too. If you read what Czechoslovakia was and how it saw itself in that period, it's not a Britain. It's not a mini Britain. It's not even a mini Ukraine.
And not even a mini
time.
Poland.
No,
Poland could have fought far more effectively.
Exactly.
If we
yes. Actually, I mean, we're not just saying this as Brits. I mean, the real tragedy in terms of fighting the Nazis was the French. They should have fought far better, given the material they had available. There's a remarkable statistic, and I'm not going to be able to remember it at the top of my head, so I am paraphrasing here. You'll have to look it up for the exact accuracy. But there were far more motor vehicles in France than there were in Germany when the Second World War began.
Their army was larger. They had more artillery units, more of everything.
Yeah, the biggest difference was the communications. The Germans had far better means of communications that allowed for blitzkrieg, and France just wasn't able to respond in time. But even then, there's, I think, much more that could have been done, and it was just a disastrous campaign predicated on assumptions that will prove to be wrong. And of course, you could say, that was the same case with Ukraine. Those who believed that it was not going to fight, that it stood no chance, they were wrong too, but just in a very different way.
Absolutely. Well, they're a good place to sort of wind up there, and especially with Ukraine on the ascendancy, which could form the subject of our next conversation. For now, though, Francis, thank you so much. It's delightful to be back here. It's an honour, and I strongly recommend people to follow your work, if indeed they're not already. I think most of them will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. The honour is mine, and thank you to all of those watching or listening to this who follow us on Ukraine the Latest. It's very much appreciated, and let's hope that this year brings better news.
Let's unpack the book, The Dark Heart of Russia, because it helps to explain how we got to this point. It's edited by me, Jonathan Fink, the creator and host of the Silicon Curtain podcast. It's published this month by Gibson Square in London and is already available for order and delivery online, though officially the PR release will coincide with the Phantom Victory Day parade in Moscow on May the 9th. 30 interviews, 30 voices selected from over 1,000 interviews that have been conducted on this channel. And the lineup that we have put into this book reads like a who's who of the people Moscow would most like to silence. Bill Browder, Garry Kasparov, Fiona Hill, General David Petraeus, Peter Pomerantsev, Luke Harding, Mark Galeotti, Keir Giles, Anders Puck-Nielsen, Alexander Etkind, Yuri Felshtinsky, General Ben Hodges, and many, many more. And with a strong set of Ukrainian voices included, it could be no other way. Volodymyr Ermolenko, Alena Holoshka, Sasha Dozhik, Olga Takaryuk, and Alexander Romantsova, among several others. And the timing is not accidental. We are releasing this book precisely as the Kremlin's central myth, the myth of Russian victory, Russian strength, Russian inevitability, is being shredded in real time. Ukraine matters, and I think this book matters, and our support for Ukraine is the only way of stopping Russian imperialism from its eternal outward expansion and the destruction that it brings in its wake.